And if you don't have anything, nobody can take anything away from you. Seneca says something interesting. He says somewhere in one of his letters, cease to hope and you'll cease to fear, because hope is dependent on the future.
Welcome to Stoa Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros, and today I am speaking with Professor Mark Usher, a professor of classical languages and literature at the University of Vermont. He is also a carpenter and a farmer. His books include How to Care About Animals, How to Say No, and How to Be a Farmer. These are all a part of an Ancient Guide to Life series. That's Princeton's An Ancient Guide to Life series. Well, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Well, today we'll focus on cynicism, the philosophy of cynicism. But before doing that, I was struck by looking at your biography. Musonius Rufus says the best vocation for a philosopher is to be a farmer. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, of course, I would agree. I would agree with it, but I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure I'm a philosopher. But farming does inculcate all the right habits. Teaches you patience. Teaches you character. So yeah, there's a lot going for farming in terms of organic philosophy. Let's call it not bookish for sure. Learning as you do and as you try and trial and error. So philosophy is a lot about that, and so is farming.
Right, right. And Musonius Rufus says it gives you, of course, that connection to nature. And he also says it gives you more time to philosophize, which I'm not sure if that's true. I don't know if he was a farmer, so maybe that may or may not be true.
It depends how much time you spend on the tractor. You're alone in your thoughts quite a bit with
Mm.
repetitive manual work, and of course, farming in antiquity was a lot of repetitive manual work. Hoeing a field or plowing a field, and so I guess it's that time alone.
Mm.
Without music in your ears and just the sounds of nature around you. So it's got to be conducive to thinking clearly.
Hmm. Yeah, that seems plausible to me. Well, today we want to talk a little bit about the philosophy of cynicism, and of course, the first question that arises is, what is cynicism? What exactly are we talking about?
So it's a philosophy for the dogs. The word cynic, as you probably know, but maybe your listeners don't know, means dog or dog-like in ancient Greek. So it was a moniker that was cast as an aspersion on people who lived this lifestyle and preached on the streets. They were called cynics by others, not by themselves, and it had a lot to do with their shameless behavior. They lived on the streets like stray dogs. They basically dumpster dived for their food, or you know begged for it as a dog would. And they kind of cultivated this image. And many of the anecdotes that we have about the cynics, they play that up.
Hmm.
But I always like to think that the cynics were, in some ways, the truer. I'll get a lot of flack for this, I think, for saying this, but the truer descendants of Socrates than perhaps Plato and the academics were, or even the Stoics were. I mean, the barefoot, disheveled Socrates, not a care in the world, who was pretty much a parasite on other people. Um, the Cynics resemble that in many, many ways, and there are a lot of we can talk more about it if you want, but there are a lot of parallels between the Socratic calling and the Cynic calling to philosophize in public. And there's a hint of it, I think, even in Plato, and I think it might go back to Socrates himself originally, and that is Plato in the Republic famously argues that the most philosophical animal is the dog,
Hmm.
because a dog knows instinctively what belongs in its domain and what does not. So the master and the people in the house he's friendly to, but an intruder or something foreign or something dangerous, the dog will attack. And it's all very instinctive. And Plato plays with that idea when he names his guardians the phulakes, the guardians. That's in Greek, and he's punning on in that passage where he coins that word or that technical term. That's when he says that the dog is the most philosophical animal, and the word that he uses in that context is skulax, So phulax, skulax, Plato's punning on his guardians. They're the watchdogs, literally, of the ideal society.
Mm-mm. Yeah, to what extent does the modern word cynic map onto the ancient philosophy? So, of course, sometimes people are called Stoics as well. He has a Stoic response, that lowercase Stoic,
Yep.
and it's on one hand, it's a caricature of the philosophy. You have someone who has, the idea is they are someone who's not perturbed. Maybe they don't even have much of an emotional life at all. They're stoic in that sense. They withstand. And of course, that gets uh, at something in the philosophy, but as a whole picture, it's imperfect. Would you say the same for the English word cynic?
Yeah, that's well said about Stoicism. I think it's the same for cynicism. So, the idea of a modern cynic is somebody who, has a lot of criticism but doesn't do anything about it. Is a lot of talk and critique and is enjoys showing people up or is perhaps a little bit aloof, but doesn't actually have solutions or doesn't, put the money where the mouth is, um, as it were. So, cynicism, modern cynicism in that sense doesn't map on very well to ancient cynicism because cynicism was all action. I mean, it was a lot of talk too. I mean, they put a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people down. They loved doing that, the cynics, but they were also, they woke up every day, homeless, barefoot, barely clad, and with no food. So their job for the day was to find some. You know, they definitely were living it. They were living that sort of that lifestyle intentionally, and so yeah, they weren't armchair anythings. They weren't armchair about their beliefs.
Were they always outsiders? Do you think that's an accurate claim that the cynics they tended to be at the edges of society?
Hmm. I mean, I think on the whole, yes, but there, as all of us are, we're all on the spectrum to some degree, and the cynics fell on a spectrum too, where you do get cynics who are totally outrageous and like Diogenes, uh, intentionally homeless, voluntary poverty, outrageous actions like masturbating in public, defecating in public, the exact sorts of things that humans are not supposed to do in polite company and civilized society. They did that all on purpose. But then you've got other guys like, Demonax, about whom Lucian writes, and according to Lucian, Demonax was his teacher. He was a cynic, and Lucian's life of Demonax is very. I mean, he's all but a statesman. I mean, he's like a man about town. He seems to kind of live out of doors, but of course, everyone in Greece lived out of doors. He embraces all the austerities, according to Lucian, of the Cynics, but yet he settles like public disputes. He speaks in the law courts. He's seen as sort of like an oracle that people go to ask for advice. He's urbane, quite literally, living in the city, but also kind of chic and slick. And Lucian says that he was like well versed in all the poets, and he cultivated rhetoric in a way that was appealing to Lucian, but probably unlike the kind of rhetoric that Diogenes cultivated. So, he's a much more civilized kind of cynic. Demetrius, too, the friend of Seneca, was a little bit. I mean, he also was a street preacher, as it seems, from the evidence that we have. But he also moved in kind of political circles. He was friends with the rich and famous. Probably invited to dine with them, but he associated with them, and he was actually involved with a bunch of guys who were bent on assassinating Nero, which actually included Seneca as well, which was mostly a Stoic kind of
Mm-hmm.
movement to get rid of Nero, that whole conspiracy. So he had strange bedfellows himself. So yeah, there's a spectrum, but on the whole, I think yes, you're right. They're kind of outsiders, and on purpose.
Right. Yeah. The connection to the Stoic opposition is certainly interesting uh, in Nero's time. And that's, I suppose, you do have the model of the cynic as an outsider, a critic, someone who's questioning these conventions, social conventions, as arbitrary or something of that sort. But as you
Right.
say, it's a continuum, and there are cynics who don't have, that sort of that rejection of convention that's you see in Diogenes.
I was just going to say, not, perhaps not as full a rejection, but of
Mm.
course the Cynics were also staunch conformists. We don't tend to think of them that way, but they were conformists in their own mind. They were conforming to a life according to nature, even perhaps more radically than the Stoics were. So they saw what they were up to as a life of conformity, and a studied life of conformity. So let's see how much civilization I can do without. So it's a question of where they align their thought world, and it was with nature as opposed to culture. Both with uppercase letters there.
So you have one way to frame Stoicism, of course, is that it the Stoic life is also the life according to nature. You also live according to nature. What does that mean? That means for human beings living the virtuous life, and that amounts to managing what the Stoics called preferred indifference, dispreferred indifference well, essentially making good choices. And one way to describe the difference between the Cynics and the Stoics, of which there are many, but perhaps a fundamental difference is that the Cynics don't have this idea that there are such a thing as preferred indifference. There's solely the life of virtue, living in accordance with nature, and things like wealth, health, pleasure, social status, which a Stoic might say is they're generally good, they're preferable, but one should never sacrifice them for virtue. Of course, the Cynic line is those aren't good at all. Those have nothing to do with life. Those have nothing to do with nature, understood as nature with this capital N, the way things ought to be, the telos of things. You think that's an adequate gloss?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely terrific. You did better at that than I could have. I think that is accurate. The Cynics are sort of Stoics on steroids. I mean, we couldn't. I mean, you and I, or at least I couldn't. I don't know about you. I couldn't be a Cynic. I mean, I admire them, and I think a lot of people admired them from afar. Like even Seneca admired
Mhm.
Demetrius from afar because of their single-mindedness and their commitment. I mean, they were all in, and they were sort of mascots in the cities in which they lived. They actually, because they were so extreme and they actually could do what they did, people admired them for it, as well as they had detractors too, of course. But Stoicism is much more of the middle way that anybody can be a Stoic. There's nothing preventing you from that. I mean, uh, except yourself,
Right.
and your choices. And the Cynics are a harder example to follow. That's kind of why I think of them as sort of extreme Stoics. So
Mhm.
Stoicism might be a middle way, and then maybe the Cynics are what the Buddha was before he became the Buddha. He was a shramana. He was one of these like ascetics wandering in the forest, but then he figured out that, oh, that doesn't really do it. And so he became, as it were, a Stoic to the Cynic that he was before. I mean, just an analogy, but
Yeah, that's interesting. Um, it's also, I think, fits on nicely with the Stoic philosopher Epictetus mentions the Cynics as role models, especially Diogenes. But he counsels his students that life is not for most of you, maybe all of you. And that, I think, that captures that idea that even Stoics can and did recognize the Cynics as living good lives that are worthwhile, but perhaps on their view, and this might be a difference between them and the Stoics, of course, that wasn't the life that most people should lead because of their personal constitution, social arrangements, what have you.
exactly. And the Seneca has a great letter about this, and it's in the book How to Say No. I translated it there, where he without naming them, he criticizes philosophers who go to extremes and kind of wear it on the outside. The shaggy hair, the long beard with daubs of food in it. Tatters for clothes. He says, who's going to want to be a philosopher if that's what you're looking at? I mean, that sort of sight and stench is not going to attract anybody. And he says instead, he says, be different on the inside, right? Let our outside, he uses the Latin word franz, agree with everyone else. Let it conform, but on the inside, intus, let it be different. So that kind of is encapsulates what you were saying before about the difference between Stoicism and Cynicism,
Mhm.
Epictetus's view, for instance. So Seneca was saying that even before.
Well, do you have any favorite anecdotes or stories about the Cynics?
Oh
To,
dear. Well, a lot of them. Let's see. One that just pops into my head that's not in the book, but it came up in another context that when I was writing about Thoreau. So at the beginning of Thoreau's Walden, he there's the famous kind of epigraph that says, um, I'm paraphrasing, but I cock-a-doodle doo. I don't sing an ode to dejection, he says. I do my cock-a-doodle doo like a chanticleer in the morning, if only to wake my neighbors up. And there's a great, and most people have thought that's kind of an allusion to the medieval tale of Renard the Fox and all of that. It's included in there, but there's a cynic anecdote that's similar to that as well. And I see a lot of cynic posturing on Thoreau's part. And the cynic anecdote is that Diogenes would go to a concert and the guy would start singing, and then Diogenes would stand up and interrupt him like right away and say, "Hail Chanticleer!" And the guy says, "What do you mean?" And of course, Chanticleer meaning the rooster, elector in Greek. And he says, "Well, as soon as you open your mouth, people get up and leave. People get up and leave." And it's hard to convey in the Greek. The word to get up is the same word as to like wake up in the morning. So Diogenes meant it as like a put down for the guy whose singing is so bad, people stand up and get out of the concert hall. But the idea is also a cynic trope too, right? To actually like sing from the rooftops and wake people up, wake them out of their
Mhm.
slumber. So I like that one. Boy, there's a lot of them. So maybe ask me again halfway through the interview, and I'll think of
Yeah,
another one.
yeah. I'm sure more will come up. A classic one that I think is uh, one of my favorites is just the story of Alexander the Great and Diogenes the Cynic, and Alexander, of course, wanting to meet this famous
Yeah,
philosopher, and Diogenes simply requesting, as Alexander bumbles over, that he stop
right,
blocking the sun, which I just, of course, just captures that rejection of social status, wealth, and power inherent in cynicism.
right. Ask me for whatever you like, and Diogenes, sitting there in front of his barrel or whatever it was, a pithos, sunning himself. Just step out of my sunshine, please. That's enough.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, that's a good one. Oh yeah, there's a lot of them. Wanking in public, right? Of course, that's outrageous enough. And then and he's doing it until somebody asks him, "What are you doing?" And he says, and of course, he's just waiting for it. He's just waiting for somebody to ask him so he can say, this, if only hunger were relieved by just rubbing one's stomach. And it's like, it's perfect. Now, the problem with all these little anecdotes that we do have about Diogenes, you probably know this, again, your listeners might not, is like, it's hard to know if they're historical because they form part of this larger tradition of made up anecdotes about famous philosophers, but the Cynics in particular called crai. And in later antiquity, one of the rhetorical exercises that students would practice to kind of get good at writing and coming up with good witty banter for social occasions was to compose these crai. And so a lot of them could well have been just like made up after the fact. But I have to say this about that. People say, "Oh, we don't really know if Diogenes did and said all those things." I'm going to say it doesn't matter because the legend of Diogenes and company, that it became a meme, and it became a movement and had a life of its own, such that somebody could write something later that was
Mhm.
so to the point and conveys the philosophy of cynicism so perfectly. Who cares if it ever happened? It's terrific. It's a very teachable, memorable saying. So anyway, that's that.
Yeah, no, that seems exactly right to me. Of course, if you're there is a sense in which many of these figures are a combination of factual history and myth. And it's a question of, what are we up to when we're talking about them? Often we're trying to pull out lessons or use their lives as some illustration of a larger principle. And
Mm,
uh, I think there sometimes there is the issue that, of course, if that mythical character is doing things that are impossible, then maybe they're not so useful in illustrating principles about how to live.
right.
But nonetheless, I think, at least in the case of Diogenes, he's served a useful, both philosophical and practical purpose for many people.
Yeah. Another one that falls into that category is like the consultation of the Delphic Oracle. So
Mhm.
famously, a friend of Socrates goes to the Delphic Oracle and says, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the wisest of them all?" And the Oracle says, "Socrates." And so Socrates' friend, his name is Chaerephon, comes back and tells everyone, the Oracle says you're the wisest one of all. And so Socrates then concludes, well, that must be because I don't know anything. So wisdom, true wisdom lies in ignorance or awareness of one's own lack of knowledge. So Diogenes also has a Delphic oracle story. So it goes back to when he and his father were, apparently kicked out of town for defacing the currency. So his dad was a banker, and they were doing something, shaving a little bit of silver off the side, or who knows what they were doing. And his dad got put in jail for it, and Diogenes was exiled. Again, this is all the story. So, and in exile, what do you do when you have no livelihood and you don't know where to turn next? You go to the Delphic Oracle, you consult it, and you say, "What should I do?" And the Delphic Oracle replied, "Deface the currency." And Diogenes said, "Well, wait a minute, I just did that. I just did that and got chucked out of Sinope, where I live." And then and then again, the story turns on this. He says, "Aha! It's deface the currency is parakaraxai ton nomisma in Greek. And that word nomisma can mean currency in both senses, just as it does today. It can mean actual currency, like, cash on the nose, um,
Mhm.
or it can mean cultural currency, what is accepted as, legal tender in behavior and manners and ethics. And so Diogenes took it upon himself with Delphic approval to deface the cultural currency of his time. And Julian, in the book, Julian makes a big deal about that calling from Delphi to be, the way he was, as sanctifying it and legitimizing his life and philosophy. But again, there did that happen? You know, People consulted the Delphic Oracle all the time in moments of crisis. Personal and states did the same thing, but it doesn't matter because it's a great story, and it gives you purpose in thinking about when you wake up hungry in the morning. Why am I doing this? Aha, I've got a Delphic mandate, like Socrates, to do this.
Right, right. Yeah, absolutely. So, what if you're thinking about the Cynic life? It's a philosophy of life, sort of an account of how to live well, what the good life looks like, and how to live well. Um, and to what extent does it have, like other philosophies of life, Stoicism, skepticism, what have you, a training program? What's an account of either exercises, philosophical techniques for becoming better, for living well?
Hmm. I mean, the Cynics definitely had a training program. I mean, they gave us that word, ascesis. Ascesis in Greek means training, and it's
Mm,
where the English word you probably know, ascetic, comes from. So, they weren't the world's first ascetics by any means, the Cynics, but they gave us the word, and that the word actually comes from the domain of wrestling and sports. So it literally does mean exercise and training as an Olympic athlete would train. So they viewed their kind of their life living their life close in accordance with nature, and testing themselves physically. They had a word for it, panos, like hard work. They did that on
mm,
purpose to train the body so that, but voluntarily to train, right? So that when push came to shove and you didn't have a choice to be without or to have food or whatever it was, you could endure it. because your muscles were strong, your ethical muscles, your mental resources were strong, and you could resist the kind of the whims of fortune. You didn't know what could happen tomorrow, so it was a way of being prepared for whatever would come your way, and that kind of training was well. Actually, Diogenes says it's also pleasurable. Like you actually learn to like doing without, and it becomes kind of a, I don't know what it becomes. Not pleasure, but like, well, he says pleasure, he uses the word pleasure, but like a game.
Mm.
So, are you better than yourself? Let's see. Are you really better than yourself? That whole notion of being the master of yourself, controlling yourself. They thought, how far could we push that, and how much can I do without? And it became like a challenge and a so. What is the end game of that? I'm not sure. For the Stoics, it's to the Stoics have a much more elaborate, comprehensive worldview about humans' place in the natural world and in the social world and everything. They thought all those things through. Cynics really didn't, as far as I can see. It wasn't their shtick. So, but anyway, they went to great extent to train themselves to be able to make it. So in a post-apocalyptic world where all the other humans are gone, there would be cynics, cynics, dogs left over at the end of it.
That's too funny. I suppose so. You have that idea of building self control by exposing yourself to voluntary discomfort, and the cynics do that on a whole nother level. It's like the voluntary discomfort. We're not going to sleep. Seneca says, "Go some nights and sleeping on the floor," and the cynics say, "Just don't have a house. That you don't need to just go a few nights. It's a matter
Exactly.
of really exposing oneself to the discomforts that are closer to the extreme end that one might experience in
Right.
life, not just sort of moving in that knob just a little bit. The cynics go the whole way.
Yeah. I think the cynics saw themselves as like exemplars. I mean, like examples. Like they made an example of themselves because most people won't bother. So they were extreme on purpose, more so on purpose to draw attention, to kind of like swing the pendulum back or something. Um,
Hmm.
Stoics were much more balanced and reasonable in that way.
Yeah. But I guess you to some extent you touched on this already. But what is that end game? That's almost the experiencing voluntary discomfort is almost a defensive type strategy where you can live well even in terrible circumstances like that. Those external circumstances won't harm you. You'll have the self-control required to act well. But then there's that question: what does acting well look like? What's the positive vision of life that's not merely like withstanding
Yeah.
discomfort, suffering for its own sake?
Good point. Autonomy, I think. I mean, they were into autonomy and what they called autarkia, sufficing for yourself and not being dependent upon anybody or anything that can be taken away at any moment. So I think that they felt free. I mean, freedom, autonomy, freedom, autarkia, all these things are, I think, part of what they were after in their extreme way. And they had to have it. I mean, how can you wake up every morning, you know, without a place to live, with not knowing where your the next meal is coming from, and be content and be happy and be able to do it for your whole life. I mean, and cynicism was a long lived, I won't call it really a philosophy, but a way of life that lasted till late antiquity, until it kind of morphed into Christian monasticism. So, and that had a very different motivation, though many of the trappings and many of the same ideas of like training went
Hmm.
into it. It kept a lot of people happy. Maybe they were so dissatisfied with cultural forms and cultural norms that this was, uh, paradise compared to that.
Yeah. I suppose it's important to remember the many of these ancient philosophies when they thought about freedom. It wasn't so much like the capacity to do whatever one liked or the capacity to have multiple options open. It was rather a vision where you have the desires you ought to have and then acted on those. So for the Cynics, they might see so many of our desires are arbitrary matters of social convention, and that's why you see them do all these outrageous things, at least classically, to signify the rejection of those conventions.
Right. And if you don't have anything, nobody can take anything away from you. Seneca says something interesting that's, I don't know how stoic it really is. It probably is, card carrying stoic, but he says somewhere in one of his letters, cease to hope and you'll cease to fear, because hope is dependent on the future. It's like you're, and if you don't hope, uh, you won't be disappointed. So there's something also in freedom that I think is conducive to equanimity and just living in the present. Nobody is miserable in the present, if that's exactly where you are and that's where exactly you want to be. And I think a lot of the Cynic austerity was about living in that present. I mean, moment
Mhm.
to moment and abiding in it. I mean, it almost sounds religious. It was perhaps more so than it was a philosophy. There isn't a
Oh,
lot of arguments
yeah.
in cynicism, philosophical ones. In Stoicism, there's tons. I mean,
Mhm.
yeah, you've got physics, you've got the logic, you've got the ethics. The whole thing is like an egg, and it all works together. And they like very sophisticated theories. The Stoics, Cynics, they didn't even care. They didn't even care about education, or singing and dancing and the poets and all that. It was like they said, "Don't bother. Why bother? What good does it do you?" I think one of the images that Seneca attributes to Demetrius the Cynic is that Demetrius was always fond of saying, Seneca says, it's better to know a couple of wrestling moves rather than a whole encyclopedia of them, because you only need to know the move you need to win the bout. You don't need any more than that. So just know a couple of good tricks that work for you and work really well, and don't hypothesize and cultivate all the possibilities. Don't overthink it. Just you know yeah, keep it simple. And Seneca says he admired Demetrius for that. It was one of his signature sayings. Yeah.
Right, right. Yeah, he says the same thing for philosophy. You just need the philosophical moves that help you win, essentially. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier the Cynics following in the footsteps of Socrates. I always think that's a useful frame to understand these philosophies, because of course the skeptics, they took some parts of Socrates' life, his philosophy, and saw themselves as the true successors of the man. And then you have, of course, the Stoics doing the same thing. How did the Cynics follow in Socrates' footsteps?
Well, well, because they were almost exclusively focused on ethics, as probably was the historical Socrates, even though we get the reports from Plato that he was reading Anaxagoras when he was a young guy and all that sort of stuff. But, that exclusive focus on ethics, the urbanity or the urban setting of it, uh, and the out of doors nature of Cynic lifestyle, um, those things in particular are very Socratic. The use of like analogies and comparisons from everyday life, uh, even like really lowbrow comparisons that
Hmm.
Socrates was famous for and got criticized for by his highfalutin high society friends and patrons. So washerwomen, cobblers, carpenters, stonemasons. The Cynics were very much about that kind of everyday down and dirty kind of comparisons, and philosophy in the gutter, as it were. Um, so, I mean, in those ways, it just seems like it's spiritually, as it were, a closer succession, and the fact that they didn't claim to teach anybody anything. I mean, really, they were. It's all about example, all about bios, the way of life. Those things seem to me to be
Hmm.
Socratic, more so than the later developments in Stoicism in the Academy or Aristotle, for that matter.
Right, right.
that's not to knock Aristotle, Plato, the Stoics. I mean, that it's amazing the direction that philosophy did take after Socrates, and that Socrates inspired it and was always like the thread running through it all. It all does all boil down to how you live, how to live a life, how to have a life. All that is all the superstructure of philosophy is subservient to that basic thing. The Cynics said that's enough for us. That basic how to live a life, how to have a life, how to be happy or content is the point. And so it's like, actually, famously, cynicism is said to be a shortcut to virtue. I think a Stoic actually said that. It's the shortcut to virtue. So you don't have to go through all that, the doctrines and mastering physical theories and all this sort of stuff to get there. It's like again, I mentioned Buddha before, but it's like, I think the Buddha told some sort of parable about a raft. Like if you're crossing a river, you have a raft, right? And you get to the other side of the river with the raft. Only a fool would put it on his back and start carrying it around wherever you go. Once you've reached there, it's like discard it. You don't need it anymore. And it was sort of like that's what the Dharma is, right? You just like get rid of it once you've made it to the other side. The Cynics were more of that mentality about what was useful or not for a good life.
Yeah, you only need the theory insofar as it's conducive to living well. And perhaps another Socratic connection is that Socrates himself was not the theorizer, it was his students who put his work into the systematic philosophical worldviews. And you could think of that as a mistake, and perhaps some of the cynics did.
Yep. And he was more interested in showing other people up than making, well, it seems, than making positive statements. And the Cynics share that as well. They love to show people up, not for its own sake, but because, well, people need showing up. I think that the Cynics were optimists in many ways. I mean, I don't think they were. There's a lot of absurdity in cynicism. They seem to embrace the absurd and see the absurd in day to day life. But I think fundamentally they are still rationalists. There are a couple of anecdotes about that. Diogenes says somewhere that you have to use either logos to live your life, reason, or you might as well use a brachos. And brachos can mean two things. It can mean like a noose, like you might as well hang yourself if you're not going to be a rational person because you're never going to solve any problems or live a good life. Or it could mean also reins. So you either need to use your logos, your reason, or you need to actually have like a straitjacket on to prevent you from doing what you're not supposed to do because you can't control yourself. So I think there's something about cynicism that does still puts a premium on rationality and the human ability to choose.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose that's one of the central Socratic threads that runs through most of these philosophies is that, for the Stoics, if you change how you think, you can make better decisions, live that life according to nature, and you can manage your emotional life as well. Skeptics, they think the same. They just think you need to hold those competing views in mind and not embrace either in order to find that tranquil state.
Right.
Yeah. Who do you think of, or who comes to mind as the cynics today, or at least people who have some of the most cynic elements either in their philosophy or their life?
Well, take away the fancy suits and all the makeup and the the entertainment aspect of it, or the extreme entertainment aspect of it, and stand-up comedians are great cynics. I mean, Stephen Colbert, maybe. So stand-up late night comedy has a good cynic aspect to it, I think. Maybe it leans more toward that modern sense of cynicism that we were talking about before. I don't know. But one of my favorites that I write about in another book that I have is Mr. Money Mustache. Have you ever heard of Mr. Money Mustache?
I know of Mr. Money Mustache, yes.
Okay, so he's like a guy who he's like a dude who like in his early 40s was able to retire, maybe even in his 30s, because he made enough money to retire. And then he figured out that you only need $24,000 a year to live. And so if you invest and expect a 4% return, you can, if you only need like $600,000 to have saved up to be able to live off, you know, the income of your investments for the rest of your life, $24,000 a year. So he basically has a website. He gives like, investment advice, but he also gives a lot of lifestyle advice. And it's a whole cult of mustachians who kind of do the same thing. His real name is Peter Adaney, but he's kind of like a modern day cynic. You know? uh, a bunch of years ago, there's a really annoying guy. Uh, what was his real name? Colin Bevan, who did a stunt to live with no impact in an apartment in Manhattan, and he dragged his wife and his baby daughter along with him. And so progressively over the course of a year, they tried to do without carbon carbon footprint impact. So no paper diapers. They shut off the electricity at their apartment eventually, and he made a film about it called No Impact Man, or somebody made a film about him. I don't know
Mhm.
if you're familiar with that.
Mm-mm.
That kind of like stunt mentality of doing something to, or that guy who, what's that guy who supersized me guy, the guy who ate all that,
Oh,
junk,
right, right.
Morgan something.
Hmm.
He ate all that junk food just to show how bad it is for you. Um, you know, that's kind of, I think it's a similar impulse to what the cynics were up to. To do something more so to draw attention to a point, to sacrifice yourself almost,
Hmm.
and but make it very public, um, to draw attention to something.
Yeah, I suppose media and the internet give you new opportunities to do that, to share your at least cynic style message with many more people.
But
Uh,
you asked the wrong person about modern anything because I don't really pay attention. I don't know how to use my phone. I don't, never. So yeah, I don't even know what's out there. There's probably so many cynic type people on TikTok or whatever's whatever people do these days, and I just don't know about it. It would be interesting to hear from somebody who follows that, because I bet you'd find a lot of it.
do other philosophers or writers, artists come to mind? Not necessarily modern ones, but people who you think also captured some of that cynic spirit.
Well, yes, but this guy's a real philosopher too, in a way, but he's not. I don't think he gets a lot of traction amongst academic philosophers because he doesn't bother to substantiate every jot and tittle that he points out. Byung-Chul Han. I don't know if you've ever read any Byung-Chul Han. He's a
Hmm.
Germano-Korean philosopher, Korean-born, writes in German, lives in Berlin. I love that guy. He writes like teeny tiny books that you can read like before you go to bed, the whole book. But they're aphoristic. It's like reading Nietzsche almost. They're very declarative, but his cultural critique of the digital world we live in, and our willingness to give up our autonomy and our humanity to neoliberalism or whatever else, whatever ever god that is out there, is remarkable. So he strikes me as, you know cynic like,
Hmm.
and I like his work.
Interesting, interesting. Yeah, I suppose to some extent, I haven't read any of his work, but you see maybe Nietzsche has some cynic elements, of course, also some non-cynic ones.
Yeah, there's a lot of cynic posturing in Nietzsche. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. um,
Yeah, yes, that provocateur type approach to philosophy.
right. I
Uh,
mean, but Nietzsche was also a hypochondriac, and he was ascetic in his own way. But yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it was so learned. If anything, it's a very cultivated cynicism.
mhm.
Somebody like Thoreau might be a little closer to it because. he actually like did the experiment and lived in the cabin. I mean, a lot of people can't stand Thoreau, but a lot of his rhetoric, his put downs, his puns. The Cynics were great punsters, by the way. I mean, I suggested it a couple of times with some of the anecdotes I mentioned with the, the Chanticleer elector, but also the Logos Brachos pun. But there's tons of them in the surviving Crai, and Thoreau was big on that wordplay to score points to his opponent's disadvantage.
Hmm. Yeah, that's excellent. Well, we touched on this at the very beginning, but I think it's more to return to. Any more thoughts on what are some of the central similarities between Stoicism and Cynicism as you see it, and also what's that those crucial lines of difference?
Yeah. Well, maybe that virtue is. I mean, honestly, I don't know as much about Stoicism as many people you've had on this show. So I'm going to refrain from pontificating here. But certainly, that virtue is sufficient
Hmm.
um, uh, for happiness. They share that. The living according to nature, though that becomes defined differently by each of them. The Stoics are much more sophisticated in their definition of that, what they mean by nature, and in its many aspects, and they're frankly more useful in that way. The focus on ethics. I mean, those are the things I see that are closest. I mean, cynicism, again, a shortcut to virtue. Um, eh, you know, it, it could get old quickly to be a cynic, where Stoicism has a depth, and it's a system that you can latch onto at many different points and explore further and refine and think on. And it's got a longer tradition of that reflection. I mean, the Cynics were oralists; they didn't write anything down, so that's one problem. We don't. I mean, there are tragedies, attributed to Diogenes and some cynic type people. They invented the satire, the Menippean satire. So it's not like they were completely not literary, but on the whole, they were oralists. So that's a problem, and a difference in the way we were able to access them and appreciate them from this point in time.
Hmm. Right, right. Yeah, I suppose for people who are interested in Stoicism, they found it useful. Knowing about Cynicism, I think, is uh, both a useful or at least an interesting challenge, and I think can provide maybe some other forms of models, exemplars to think through. So you have on the challenge side, there's that question: when are Stoics or any other philosopher taking convention too seriously as a guide to what the virtuous acts are? In Stoicism in particular, you have ideas of role ethics. How which of those roles should one take seriously? Is a serious question you get from the Cynics. And then in terms of exemplars, as we've been saying, you have the model of Diogenes, Demetrius, Demonax, and so on that I think can be useful to think through.
Yeah, maybe the Cynics are lazy Stoics. Maybe that's what they are. Stoics on steroids, but also lazy Stoics. I don't know. That seems to be a contradiction, but they intellectually lazy. They just didn't care, you know. Oh,
Yeah, in some ways, if you want to be more negative against the Cynics, it does seem like they were more parasitical on people around them. They're more of a social parasite than the Stoics were. There wasn't this model of what is it to be a good citizen. And I think that one always does need outsiders to play a role in a society to challenge it, question convention,
mhm.
be exemplars for ways things could be different. But there is also that concern that actually there's something that means to be a good citizen. That means living in the city, even if you're not of it.
Yeah, yeah. It is kind of funny. They beg for their food, but they prize autonomy. They and they what Diogenes is reported to have said, that the thing that he values most is freedom of speech, so frankness of speech. So you can say whatever you want if you're not beholden to anybody, and they thought that was pretty important. I mean, we
Hmm.
don't always say what we really think. I mean, we couldn't all the time because we well, it would be a social disaster, a political disaster if we actually said out loud all the things that we really think. And the Cynics were able to do that in a way that others couldn't, and because they were beholden to anybody. So there's something beneficial in that, and it was accepted, kind of like, oh, a cynic can say that. It's kind of like stand-up comedy. Sometimes I watch that, like late night television. I said, oh my gosh, I teach in the academy, right? I couldn't say those things. I could not be a stand-up comedian in front of my classes, not that I would want to be, because you'd be canceled. I mean, you can't say those things in this arena, but you can say them on TV in that context because you're a late night comedian, and there's all sorts of expectations about it. So I think the Cynics may have been some sort of like cultural conscience in a way too, that they could do it. The raving cynic on the corner telling the truth to everyone who passed by. Like, it's good to hear that once in a while. Who else is going to tell me? You know that I've got bad breath and a wart on my nose, and that my inside ethic, my lifestyle is even worse than that. Who's going to say that to you except a cynic on the side of the road? Um, and can you take it? Yeah. So
Yeah, yeah. I think that the connection to the stand-up comedians is on point because they are a group of people who often are able to point out truths that one cannot in ordinary conversation and do it in a way that, of course, they have their own social sphere to do it well, but there's an art, a kind of skill in
right.
telling a good joke that would be completely off color in most contexts, and even sometimes is off color in the comedic context
Right.
as a way, and that's a way to reveal the way that things really are in a way that's not as almost not as crude or
Yeah.
uh, as dangerous as other ways might maybe.
So here's an overwrought and overthought statement. So at the end of the city state, the polis falls into decline. Old comedy goes away. New comedy comes in, and it's just basically melodrama. It's like a soap opera, menander and blah blah blah. And who steps in to fill the void for old comedies like social critique and telling the truth, right? Freedom of speech. It's the cynics. So yeah, maybe we are right that the stand up comedian thing is close. So,
Excellent. Well, is there anything else you'd like to add?
no, no. So yeah, I enjoyed talking about the cynics.
Yeah, yeah, very good. Thanks for coming on, and we'll have to maybe touch on animals or farming at another time.
Love to do that.
Thanks for listening to Stoa Conversations. Please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with a friend. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.